everyone, and welcome to First Fridays. On behalf of the First Friday Committee and the Ask Department, welcome to First Fridays. I'm Caitlin Marino, co-chair of the First Fridays Committee. Welcome back to our regular guests, and a special welcome to any of you who are here for the first time. First Fridays is a monthly series of presentations made possible by a generous gift from Governor Elmer L. Anderson and Mrs. Eleanor Anderson in honor of former library director Dr. Edward B. Stanford. The presentations are based on materials in the university's libraries, archives, and special collections. This year's theme is We Are Here, Women in the Archives, focusing on female identifying stories. And a reminder that we are streaming and video will be available later on the UMN Library's YouTube channel. Today's presentations focus on the Charles Babbage Institute Archives and the Social Welfare History Archives. Lunch today is from Sawat D, and there will be a tour after the presentations from Jennifer Claiborne. Do you want to wave? She's in the back corner there waving. So after the presentations conclude, if you want a tour, please just go find her in the back there. Before we move on to the rest of the program, we do have a short announcement from Kirsten Clark about Friends of the Libraries.
Hi everybody, my name is Kirsten Clark. I work at the University Libraries, but I'm also a board member with the Friends of the Libraries. So just wanted to give a bit of a shout out. Obviously we have the support that was mentioned earlier for these programs, but a lot of our other events that happen in the libraries are through support through our friends. So I have a little bit of information at the back table about the friends, but besides just having the larger Friends of the Libraries group, several of the collections, and some of them are part of this series, have their own friends groups. So I'm just going to mention those quickly. There's the Associates for the James Ford Bell, the Treader Collection, the Curlin Friends, the Friends of the Anderson Horticultural Library, and the Friends of the Sherlock Holmes Collection. So again, if you need want any additional information, it's back at the table, or you can talk with me and enjoy the presentations today.
Our first presentation today is Unsung, Outnumbered, Unspoken by Amanda Wick, Interim Archivist, and Ashley Squierra, is that correct? Processing Archivist. The turbulent stories of women in STEM professions and the high-tech industry have recently garnered a great deal of media attention. Despite this increased attention, the archives of women in computing are often ignored in favor of collections that narrate their stories through the voice and perspective of powerful men in the field. This talk will recenter the legacy of women in computing using their own words, writings, and discoveries.
So over the last few years, as Caitlin just mentioned, we have been bombarded by media stories, film, think pieces, books, and TV shows discussing the dwindling representation of women in STEM professions. These, in my mind, echo certain issues that we've talked about during this lecture series as a whole with regards to the representation of women within the larger national historical narrative and their presence or lack thereof of women's stories in the archives. Like pretty much every other field, women have always been present and even central figures within the history of computing, yet we can rarely name more than one. Today, Ashley and I will be talking about the representation of women's perspectives within the contemporary history of computing, and focusing in particular on one woman, Jean Sammet. In the earliest days of modern computing, women held almost half of all computing-related jobs in this country. This is because at that time, computing was considered clerical and women's work. Right? At the same time, higher ed opportunities in computing were limited or embedded within mathematics or electrical engineering departments, which was a fairly high barrier to entry for many young women. However, as computing began to become recognized as a highly skilled, lucrative profession, and one with a certain amount of prestige and mystique, you see the amount of women enrolled in the programs rising, but at the same time, the numbers of women actually working in the field dropping as more and more men began to apply for the same jobs. In the mid-1980s, we hit that happy point where women in computer science programs maximize and almost equal the number of women within the profession. Yet these numbers drastically dwindle during the 90s and aughts. And these trends are somewhat reflected in the archives, except I would venture to say that we're actually worse in terms of proportional presence of women versus men, at least in the computing history archives. So, CBIA, or the Charles Babbage Institute Archives, has about 22 collections created solely by women. This is out of a total of 260 collections, so about 0.08% of our material. Some of these women were foundational figures in early computing: Margaret Fox, Frances Betty Holberton, Jean Sammet, and Claire Schultz, while others are more recent, including Mary Whitten, Joan Collins, who are both pioneers in computer graphics, and Terry Benzel, who is a huge figure in computer security. Gender in computing is also a massive topic for researchers right now visiting CBI. And lots of people do come here to do research on it, but face a lot of issues actually servicing some of the material in our collections due to some outdated archival practices. So at CBI, for example, previous archivists, we had a tendency to prioritize the description of technical computing subjects over what we could call the more cultural or social subjects. And that tends to bury, actually, the voices of women and their perspectives. Historians studying the history of computing also face a pretty serious issue that I'm going to just call single versus group achievement. When we think about scientific history, there's a disturbing pattern of the suppression of women's involvement in group achievements. So when we think about the discovery of DNA, we know the names Watson and Crick, but the mention of Rosalind Franklin, who was a chemist, crystallographer, and a critical member of their research team, is largely forgotten. And this tendency is especially prevalent within the history of computing. We're currently aggressively collecting in this space and working to make our existing collections created by women or representing the perspectives of women more visible and accessible. In my capacity as the CBI archivist, I'd also try very hard to personally bring the collections of women to the attention of researchers studying gender and tech issues. But still, I found that researchers ignore the women's collections. In fact, I once asked a prominent historian in the field why he wanted to access the corporate and group administrative records when researching women in computing and not the collections created by women. His response was that he wasn't interested because he thought that they would be too subjective to look at early on in his research. Meaning that this extremely qualified individual consciously chose to allow the records of male-dominated institutions to establish his objective frame of reference for understanding the experience of women in tech before listening to the voices of women themselves. And it's this sort of really tiny detail that seems kind of innocuous because, yeah, he's going to get to it eventually. But it's actually quite insidious, and it does lead to the downplaying or decentering the contributions of women and their personal experiences in the computing field. So suddenly the women are now outsiders to their own history because their voices are considered too subjective to be heard first. But beyond these general issues with a woman's history of computing, we're here today to talk about one foundational figure in particular, Jean Sammet. She was the developer of multiple programming languages, a recognized leader within the professional organizations of computing history. And Ashley's going to talk a lot more about her work, but I want to provide just a little bit of background on her collection and how it came to CBI. Because first, Jean was really instrumental in the formation of the Charles Babbage Institute. She was a member of the influential History Committee at the Associated Federation of Information Processors, which contributed to the founding of the Annals of the History of Computing, which is a really prominent journal in the field. As well as the formation of an active research organization, which eventually became the Charles Babbage Institute. Jean's intention to donate her personal papers to CBI began in the late 1980s when she opened a period, for lack of negotiation with archivist Bruce Brammer. The communications are absolutely legendary. And some of my favorite things I've seen in our archive. Just in terms of the language and her force of personality, it's just immediately apparent. She also seems to have authored her own deed of gift. It is certainly not standard. It is insanely complex. She actually somehow convinced IBM, which was her longtime employer, to let her walk out with all of her records that she created while she was there. Also not standard. But a huge asset to us who are studying the history of computing. In fact, she was so strong-willed that somehow an IBM company rep actually signed the deed of gift as well, kind of to ratify the donation decision. So we have these records in a legit fashion. Thank you. But along with this complexity, she also tried to establish a really convoluted schedule for accessing the materials and when they could be processed and made available to researchers. It was so complex that it kind of became this piece of urban legend that no one could touch Jean's papers until she had passed on and the rest of her material came to us. So last year, after she had passed away and we received 400 boxes of material, we still had 178 boxes that were still taped up that we had not touched yet. So yes, archivists can contribute to silencing and erasure of women's history as well. Because actually we could have made them all available probably like 8 years ago, so. But a final thing about Jean Sammet. As I mentioned, she was instrumental to the formation of the Charles Babbage Institute, but I was not actually aware of how instrumental she was to the formation of our archives. So here are 2 letters illustrating her recognized at the time leadership in establishing a formal archive to support historical research at CBI. On the left, hard to see, but it's a note that details her leadership and taskmastership, for lack of a better word, of the formation of a documentation strategy. While on the right, you have one of the clearest indicators of a personal relationship between 2 absolutely towering women in the field of computing, Grace Hopper and herself, that recognizes Jean's desire to create an active historical collecting effort. But none of us at CBI who work there today really had any idea of the degree to which she was involved in this effort. I mean, we knew she was there, but we didn't know that she was the driver. So that just kind of goes, in my mind, to demonstrate what we're talking about, because she wasn't the first, she wasn't the only, so her voice has been erased. So I'm going to have Ashley come forward now to recenter Jean's story using her own thoughts and records.
Thank you, Amanda. First, I want to say I've been coming to these First Fridays for about 3 or 4 years now, and I've never thought I'd be able to present at one. So I'm really excited, too. From childhood on, I hated to throw papers away. As I became an adult, this characteristic merged with my interest in computing history. As a result, I created important files and documents of my own and became concerned with having other people publish material on their important work so the facts, rather than the myths, would be known publicly. Jean E. Sammet. Jean Sammet was born in New York City on March 23, 1928. At the age of 7, she decided she liked that number stuff. Because she was a girl, Jean could not attend Bronx High School of Science, so instead she went to the all-girls Julia Rickman High School, where she took all of the math courses offered. After, she enrolled in Mount Holyoke College because of their mathematics program, and went on to obtain a Master of Mathematics from University of Illinois. In the 1940s and 50s, computer science was not in the forefront of Jean's mind as a career. She wanted to teach, but New York wasn't hiring teachers at the time, and she did not take the required classes about New Jersey history to teach there. So instead, she worked as an actuary for Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. In 1955, Jean found herself at Sperry Gyroscope, doing torpedo analysis for the Navy, and was asked if she wanted to be a programmer for a digital computer. "What's a programmer?" she asked. "I don't know, but I know we need one," she was told. Jean's pioneering work as a programmer led her to seek more computer-focused employment. However, in the 1950s, classified ads weren't separated by gender, and there were no computer positions advertised for females. However, that did not stop Jean from applying to Sylvania Electric Products. When asked if Jean had hesitations applying for the position, she answered, "Because programmers were very scarce. It didn't matter whether you have 3 heads." So these photos of job advertisements do not make it explicit that they were for male positions, but they don't look very inviting, and they look like it's a man's work. A few years later, Jean settled on IBM in their data systems division, doing advanced development work in programming. Jean's note on the left is the first of many we will see that illustrate her thought process. So on the very left of the note, in her job possibilities and contacts, it shows the company that she applied for, who she had contacted there, the persons either she knew or that she had talked to, if she had an interview and where, and what the status was of her application. Jean spent the next 27 years with IBM, and her transition from being one of the guys to making her own name for herself was not one without obstacles. In a recent interview, Jean mentioned she was not going to think discrimination was happening unless she had clear evidence. Whether or not Jean did have clear evidence may have been unknown, even to her, as we will discover. On the left, there's an article from an IBM publication that illustrates some of her accomplishments from around when she retired in 1988. The top right column reads, "Sammet made history, today she writes it," referring to her book, Programming Languages, History and Fundamentals, which was described as an instant computer classic and the standard work on programming languages. After the publication of her book, Jean became a prominent name in the programming field. If someone had a question about programming languages, they talked to Jean. Publications such as Computer World and various newspapers and magazines would regularly interview Jean for her perspective. By 1969, Jean helped develop a few languages, but covering about 120 computer languages and at over 700 pages, her book took an immense amount of research, and much of here is in Jean's collection. If Jean was going to take on a project, she made sure it was her best work and effort. At the time of this article in 1988, Jean was working on an update to her book, though it was never published. My apologies if this slide is hard to read. I tried my best to include as many of Jean's accomplishments as possible without being impossible to read. There are arguably many more than what I've selected in this timeline, and I will only mention a few. Jean started her programming career in 1955, where she organized and supervised programming groups at Sylvania Electric Products and later at Sperry Gyroscope. Jean was one of the first to teach graduate-level computing courses held at Adelphi College and later taught at other institutions. In 1961, Jean began her career with IBM, and during that time held numerous office positions in organizations. Most notably, in 1976, Jean became the first female president of the Association for Computing Machinery in its then 27-year history. Later, Jean initiated the concept and managed development of PDL Ada from the Ada computer language, which is worthy to mention is named after Ada, Countess of Lovelace, the daughter of Lord Byron, who is credited as being the first computer programmer. In addition to all of these accomplishments, Jean has published over 50 papers and given over 100 lectures. If I had to describe Jean, I would say she is an organizer and takes initiative to do what has not been done or thought of before. As we heard from Amanda, Jean helped to create the CBIA archives among countless other tasks. As a result of her accomplishments, Jean has received many honors, which include IBM Outstanding Contribution Award for Formac, one of the first 2 people elected as an honorary member of Upsilon Pi Epsilon, member of the National Academy of Engineering, and I believe she was the 6th female. She was awarded an honorary Doctorate of Science by Mount Holyoke, received ACM Distinguished Service Award, the Association for Women in Computing Augusta Ada Lovelace Award, was a Computer History Museum Fellow, IEEE Computer Pioneer Award recipient, and most recently received the National Center for Women and Information Technology Pioneer in Tech Award. Here's a collection of news clippings that Jean kept from IBM publications. At the top, it shows her after her book was published. On the bottom, her nomination for Vice President of ACM. And on the right, after she won the President of ACM. Although Jean is well known in her field, historically she has had to fight for her place among others to be credited with COBOL. Shortly after Jean's start at Sylvania in the 1950s, she took part in a committee sponsored by the government, in which COBOL was created. COBOL stands for Common Business-Oriented Language and is a compiled computer language that uses an English syntax with a focus on in and outputs, which use numbers and large strings of text, and it's still largely used today. Something that Jean was passionate about was making sure the facts, rather than the myths, were known publicly. And when it came to COBOL, she made sure that proper credit was given. Has anyone heard of Grace Hopper before? Many believe that she created COBOL, when actually she directed the work that came beforehand. Grace Hopper was a rear admiral in the U.S. Navy and invented one of the first compiler-related tools. She popularized the idea of machine-independent programming languages, which led to the development of COBOL. Since she is one of the most well-known female computer scientists, Grace has continuously been given credit for the creation of COBOL. As you can see here, Jean was not happy about this. This is an email from Greg Walsh about the People in Software Milestones exhibit at the Computer Museum, from which the photo at the top right was taken. Jean writes, with regard to the people, you better be careful that Grace Hopper is not, I repeat, not credited with COBOL. It would be better to omit her entirely in any such discussion of COBOL. In addition to this letter, Jean was looking over a manuscript for Autumn Stanley, who would publish their book, Mothers and Daughters of Innovation, in 1994. In a section about Grace Hopper, Jean notes the following: "If you wish to continue to perpetuate the myth with regard to Grace Hopper, I guess I cannot stop you. Your wording that she is generally given credit for COBOL is indeed true, but as all the facts show, it is an inappropriate credit." Additionally, Jean makes various other comments in the same regard, as she wanted to make sure all the facts are correct. However, Jean did not hold any hard feelings toward Grace. In 1992, Jean wrote a combined obituary, biography, and commentary, unquote, "The person I personally consider to have been the greatest woman in the computer field and one of the top dozen people in the field to date." Before Jean was a recognizable figure, during getting her salutation and letters was difficult in a male-dominated field. A few examples show that Jean was often called Doctor, Mrs., sometimes nothing, maybe if they didn't want to guess wrong, and most commonly Mr. And here is a Mr. turned into a Mrs., and a Monsieur turned into a Madame. Once Jean writes back saying, "I would first like to point out that I am not a Mr. This should have been obvious from my resume, since Mount Holyoke College has been a women's college since 1837. Lastly, to avoid any potential confusion or to correct someone, Jean would often sign her name with the Miss in front in parentheses. In 1962, after Jean had just started at IBM, Lauren Bullock wrote a letter that was not addressed to Jean, but her manager, Nathaniel Rochester. It was very clear that Lauren knows Jean is a woman, because he writes, "Although Jean is a very intense young woman, she is very competent and capable, and she has given IBM a professional stature among other professional computer people in this vicinity, which we can maintain in no other way." I'm sure Lauren is trying to compliment Jean and Nathaniel for hiring her, but by using the word "although," he is saying "in spite of." And we could read it as, in spite of the fact Jean is a very intense young woman, she is very competent and capable. In my opinion, I cannot see the same sentence being said about a man, since being competent and capable is being juxtaposed with Jean being very intense. About 10 years into Jean's career at IBM, in 1971, IBM held a seminar for managers on the status of women. This article is from the December 1971 edition of Think, an IBM internal publication. The seminar was described as one of many the company is conducting to make certain that management draws upon all the talent available among IBM women. In 1971, 23,000 women worked for IBM, or 14.6%. 451, or 2.2%, were managers. A quote from Gail Berry West, then attorney for IBM, reads, "One thing managers should remember is that when interviewing, evaluating, or having any other type of encounter, they should look at the person strictly as a person. In my case, I'm more apt to be considered equal as a black than I am as a woman. The discrimination I experience as a lawyer is because I am a woman." Although today IBM and the technology industry do have more women employed in general and as managers, there's still a large gender gap. Currently, women make up about 30% of IBM's US workforce. Additionally, in 1971, there was an important ruling in Massachusetts that allowed for women to work overtime. When Jean started her career in 1950s, only about 34% of women were in the labor force, and in Massachusetts, there was laws against women working overtime. Here Jean writes to Nathaniel Rochester, "I believe that last December I discussed with you the problem of the state of Massachusetts and its laws about women working overtime. I pointed out that there were problems connected with this which were likely to get worse. I'm bringing the subject up again because I think it will become a significant problem in the future. We need appropriate coverage, either from our own personnel people or from the state. I am not sure how this ultimately was resolved, but I looked into this law, and women cannot work more than 9 hours in a day or for 48 hours a week. It was tried in 1915, but it was for the public welfare that women not work more, commonly on ground that woman is under industrial disability by reason of sex, that her physical structure and duty of maternity place her at a disadvantage, and that her strength and vitality are likely to be impaired by confining and exacting labor under adverse conditions, and that thus public welfare is injured by affecting deleteriously vigor of mothers and through them vitality of race. This reasoning applies quite as strongly where labor is not purely physical, but also mental. Jean wrote this note in 1965, but it was not until 1971 that the law against women working overtime would be unenforceable because of direct conflict with equal employment provision of the Federal Civil Rights Act. And Massachusetts' employer would be permanently enjoined from refusing to extend to female employees the same overtime opportunities given to male employees with same employment status. Although Jean doesn't have much handwritten correspondence since she preferred to type, she does have a lot of handwritten notes to herself. Like Jean's note about which job she had applied for, these are her notes as she decided if she was going to stay in Cambridge or move to Bethesda, Maryland for a different position within IBM. So here she has written some factors that she would consider about moving, and then on the very left side is how that was important to her, and then on the right was her evaluation of it. 1 was to stay and 5 go. And she did some math and came with 2.46, which is close to being in the middle, or I guess staying. After Jean did her quantitative analysis, she took time to reflect and write more notes for herself. Jean writes, "I am not being stubborn. I could be tempted because Harlan makes a very persuasive case. But it has become clear that as far as the IBM Corp is concerned, I am viewed as a failure, and I must recognize this. This is in spite of the fact, A, I have made innumerable and incredible personal sacrifices for my job. My outside activities has been supported by and encouraged by former FDS VP. Jean continues, given the existing perception of me as a failure, there's no reason that any actions of mine would be considered any more successful. I have worked to the limit of my ability, and it wasn't good enough. I can't do any better. I have such bitterness at this time, but not for Harlan, that I am in no psychological frame of mind to make such a major change. This is perhaps the turning point where Jean realizes things may not turn out how she had hoped. Jean ultimately decides to leave her position in Cambridge and go to Maryland, go to Bethesda, Maryland. As she has in her notes, tell Harlan will come assuming space problem is solvable. I'm coming voluntarily, but based on various types of pressure, enormous risk for me, sense of obligation, particularly because I have recently realized book is much less valuable to FSD because of Ada. I don't like being a charity case. He has worked hard above and beyond the call of duty, and that deserves some favorable results. Assume he will be acting manager after Claude leaves until I come down. Has October 1 as official takeover date, but will come down as much before as I can." And she continues with more. These notes Jean has to herself are important in seeing how she thinks and what is happening at the time. As researchers, we can see the why as well as the what. I have not processed the entire collection, so something I was surprised to find was this letter written by Jean. It wasn't in any folder, but among the rest of few unorganized papers. Although it was not dated, from context, this was written in 1980, after she had moved to Bethesda. Jean writes, "Dear Mr. Carey, it is with great sadness I write to you. Since in my 19 years with IBM, I have always had a small amount of contempt for people who took this route. And yet I can now see the desperation which drives people to this course. I am seriously contemplating legal action on the basis of discrimination against women. Because of my own prominence, this would probably wind up on the front page of Computer World." In the margin, she has delete reference to Computer World. However, I retain a small amount of vestige of hope and respect for the principles that this company purportedly operates under, and so I choose to write to you first. Jean goes on to support her reasoning for this, and in the margin here she sums up by saying, "Near clear statement that I am perturbed that advancement or recognition in absence of other rational explanation, mine turns to other things which I have deplored." Jean ends her letter by saying, "I'm willing to listen to some rational explanation as to why IBM has refused to give me any recognition or promotion, even though outside groups have done so. In my entire career up until now, I have never blamed anything which went wrong for me on female discrimination. In fact, I gave an interview to Computer World once in which I said that that was a cop-out, which women often took unjustifiably to cover up their own lack of competence. In the past, when I did not receive something to which I thought I was entitled, I never even thought about female discrimination as being a possible reason. But now I have reached a stage where I can't seem to find any other cause." And here Jean took out, "And there are laws against this. I have no wish to use them, but I have about reached the limits of my endurance." Now, without any other context to this, it is hard to say whether she had talked to anyone or if she had done anything before writing this. So far, I found no evidence she even sent this letter. Notwithstanding, this letter marks an important turning point in Jean's mind. Before writing this, Jean states that discrimination against women in the workplace was a cop-out. Now she has realized that after all her accomplishments in being recognized by numerous outside organizations, it is not reflected in the workplace. Even though Jean held different positions within IBM, none were ever higher than a manager. The potential to be an IBM fellow was a 5 out of 5 importance to Jean, if you remember her scale. Jean was never an IBM fellow. This is where it gets tricky to decipher if Jean felt there was or was not discrimination towards her. After reading the letter she wrote, it seems obvious that she did, even for a brief moment. However, this letter is the only evidence. In an interview from only a few years ago, Jean was asked if she had ever thought she was discriminated against. She answered with, "I never had any evidence." Perhaps Jean realized that if she had said anything, it would turn into a large controversy, and she did not want that. These are only my initial discovery of the Jean Sammet papers. Throughout the next year, I hope to uncover more of Jean's story and make it available for research. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next presentation is Danger, Women at Work, presented by Linnea Anderson, Archivist of the Social Welfare History Archives. And she will be exploring sources from the Social Welfare History Archives to learn about workplace hazards faced by factory workers, shop girls, and prostitutes, and the grim realities of women's work in the early 20th century. Archival records also show how some social workers and reformers perceived women in the workforce.
Welcome to the dangerous and often grueling world of working women in the early 20th century, when rapidly expanding industrial production and urban environments created many opportunities and frequent hazards. There are many reports and studies, articles, and pamphlets on working women's issues in the archives. I only had time to read a handful and prepared just a few examples, but invite you to visit the archives to see the collections related to women and work. As was nearly always the case in the Social Welfare History Archives, the views expressed are from social workers, reformers, and other professionals, though the voices of working women are sometimes present. A quick note, some of the images I will share today are photos that I took or black and white scans from fragile volumes. The quality is not the best, but I hope that they capture the feel of these issues. And it is interesting to point out that much of the information discussed today was collected or written by female factory investigators, journalists, labor leaders, and the female heads or staff of organizations such as the Russell Sage Foundation and the National Consumers League, or government agencies such as the United States Women's Bureau. And I will start with that icon of the progressive era. Is it going to advance? There she is. There they are. The factory girl. All three of these women pictured here were garment workers. I love Clara's tie. I want one. These women and their compatriots navigated many hazards in the workplace, but the most terrifying was fire. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is a well-known event in U.S. labor history. On March 25, 1911, fire broke out at the Triangle Waist Company garment factory on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building in Lower Manhattan. Later, investigators determined it was caused by a combination of oil cans stored near piles of scraps ignited by a cigarette. Workers in the factory, many of them young women, had little chance to escape, and the rapidly spreading fire killed 146. The building had only one fire escape, which collapsed, Tables and machines trapped some workers, others panicked and were crushed or were trapped as they struggled with doors that opened the wrong way or were locked by managers to prevent theft. Some died jumping from the building. Newspaper accounts showed photos of mangled, burned bodies of young women lying in the street outside or in their coffins in the city morgue. On this slide, on the left-hand side, the cover of Survey magazine shows the courtyard of a garment factory in New York with fire escapes leading into it and the caption, "A roasting pen." And on the right is an ad in 3 languages calling workers to come to the combination protest and funeral march for the victims of the fire. And here's a combination of profit, interest, and rent that has led to the death of these young women. The fire launched a public outcry. At a mass meeting on April 2nd held at the Metropolitan Opera House, speakers demanded change while assigning blame to industry, the factory owners, and the community. Rose Schneiderman, vice president of the Women's Trade Union League, angrily addressed the crowd, taking aim at the injustices faced by the workers. "This is not the first time girls have been burned alive in the city. Every week I must learn of the untimely death of one of my sister workers. Every year, thousands of us are maimed. The life of men and women is so cheap, and property is so sacred. There are so many of us for one job, it matters little if we are burned to death. You have a couple of dollars for the sorrowing mothers and brothers and sisters by way of a charity gift. But every time the workers come out in the only way they know to protest against conditions which are unbearable, the strong hand of the law is allowed to press down heavily upon us." The fire also led to investigations and the formation of a safety commission, and the resulting workplace standards that eventually passed in New York helped to set an example for the rest of the country. And there were calls for fireproof buildings, as shown in this diagram. So on the left-hand side, the fire is allowed to spread through the building, and on the right-hand side, there's a firewall. Apparently the workers on the other side can happily keep working during the fire emergency. Very important. Fire escapes. This one is a demonstration. So you see the male worker is lowering the fire escape so that the shop and factory girls can descend in an orderly fashion. And fire drills, such as the one shown here. And while the Triangle Fire was a shocking wake-up call that galvanized civic action, reformers and labor unions had been addressing workplace safety and fire hazards at the Triangle and other factories prior to the disaster. And there were exposés of workplace dangers in general, mostly in the context of women in industrial settings. However, these appear to have made little impact on a system that prioritized speed and profit over worker safety and conditions. In 1910, Survey published a series of articles on women in the shirtwaist and millinery factories and on the shirtwaist strike, in which over 30,000 mostly female factory workers walked out across New York City. The account of the Triangle factory cited locked doors, piles of rags and packing materials, only one elevator, and narrow stairs as hazards, and included the comment, "The building is only as fireproof as its contents." In January 1911, 2 months before the Triangle Fire, Peter McKeon, a consulting engineer, wrote Fires, Factories, and Prevention for Survey. The article references the now mostly forgotten Newark factory fire on November 26, 1910, at the Wolf Muslin Undergarment Company, in which 57 workers, mostly women, died. This slide is a photograph of the aftermath of the fire. And McKeon cited the disaster as an example of how some building owners made only a token gesture towards safety in buildings whose basic design was dangerous. The fire started on a middle floor in a lamp factory. A wooden stairway and elevator shaft burned, carrying the fire to the upper floor where the garment factory was located. And in this diagram, you can see the features and the events of the fire pointed out, including some of the hazards that blocked the women's exit from the building, the narrow stairway, and then the fact that everyone on the first and the second floors survived because they could get out. The building had fire escapes, but they were too hard to access through heavy old windows, or the lunch tables, shown on the left, blocked the access, and one fire escape led to a dead-end alley. There was a general panic. Many of the workers jumped and were seriously injured or killed, some impaled on a spiked metal fence. McKeon stated prophetically that the same conditions which existed in the Newark factory building, which killed women and girls, can be found in many other buildings, and notes that New York had nearly 30,000 factories with almost 700,000 workers in 12,000 buildings. In her article on the fire, When a Women's Workroom Burns, Mary Brown Sumner looked at the human costs. She describes the victims as suffering from fractures, displacements, contusions, or shattered nerves, pointing out that some will be invalids for years, and using terms such as nervous shock, nervous prostration, apathy, and night terrors. So women workers also dealt with dangers such as poisons and pollutants. This is a slide showing poisons women are exposed to in munitions plants. Many of the workers were women, including lead, mercury, phosphorus, chemicals, and even dust, which were more common than fire and potentially as deadly. The image on the left shows a dipper in a pottery workroom, a job that splashed her with lead glaze. And the pamphlet on the right warns about TB contracted from sweatshop work. Phossy jaw, an occupational disease involving necrosis of the jaw caused by phosphorus exposure, is the classic and horrifying example. And it is also an example of how known industrial poisons continued to be used and to impact victims for decades after they were identified as hazardous. And white phosphorus was the active ingredient of most matches from the 1840s to the 1910s. Matchstick factory workers, many of them young women, employed, as women often were, in a job requiring some manual dexterity, in this case dipping or boxing matches, were exposed to toxic levels of phosphorus when they inhaled fumes or were covered in residue. Victims of phossy jaw suffered from necrotic, meaning dead bone in the face and jaw, loss of teeth, infected abscesses, and some had their mandible bone removed to stop the spread of the symptoms which could affect the brain. A paper titled Industrial Diseases and Occupational Standards, presented at the National Conference of Charities and Corrections in 1910, includes an account of a 29-year-old woman suffering from phossy jaw that describes the nauseating stench from her condition. The young woman is quoted, mumbling because she could not speak clearly. The doctor says, "Perhaps they could cure me by cutting out my jaw, but I am young yet, and how would it look? I would rather be dead, I think." Now, these are only two examples of the types of hazards faced by some of the millions of women and girls at work in the early 20th century. And I could easily spend the rest of the talk sharing horror stories from the archives. But I also wanted to take time to explore the ideas about women, work, and danger expressed by social workers, reformers, and others. Many of the documents I read for this talk share these common themes about dangers or perceived dangers facing working women. And Ashley, I'm thinking of your speech here now. So, loss of health, loss of innocence, and subsequent threats to motherhood. Reformers described the impact of women's labor as physical and mental strain, nervousness, and fatigue. And they cited concerns for the number of hours worked and the need for a half holiday on Saturday and Sunday off. Working at night was also discouraged. And they called for seating requirements, avoiding extreme temperatures, meal and rest breaks, and sanitation facilities. And they proposed restricting women from certain industries or machines or providing safety equipment. And warned against poor posture and repetitive movements. And now I'm quoting, abnormally fatiguing motions and using mechanical devices requiring undue strength. And the speeding up of production lines was also cited as another cause of physical and mental strain. Now, these are all great features of worker protection. But when discussed in the context of working women, the records show that elements of paternalistic protection and assumptions about motherhood and gender roles sometimes influenced these recommendations. And all of these are part of an argument that certain types of work and industrial settings, the retail trade, and telephone switchboards were particularly singled out, was wearing down women's health in ways that impacted not only the individual woman, but also society as a whole. A common theme being their dual role as workers and I'm quoting, mothers of the race, and that the health of society depended on the health of girls and women. In the book Young Working Girls, a summary of the evidence from 2,000 social workers, published in 1913, the authors use words such as blight, warp, stunted, strain, stimulation, cannot have any stimulation in young women, listlessness, dullness, pale, and round-shouldered to describe the health impacts on young female workers. And such language forms an idea of youthful vigor and feminine health destroyed, which in some cases it actually was. A rather dire example of the mothering argument is found in the book A Girl and Her Chance, a study of conditions surrounding the young girl between 14 and 18 years of age in New York City, written by the Association of Neighborhood Workers and Harriet McDougall Daniels in 1914. Work hurts no one. It is overwork with the poison of fatigue in one's system that harms. It is work under unsanitary conditions and in industries where the industry itself is harmful that evil causes result. It is the long hours of standing that continue throughout the month with no regard to what the girl's physical condition might be that ruin health, that so vitally injures these potential mothers of the race and damns to degeneracy and early death the little children of our crowded city streets. Loss of innocence is another common theme. Young working women and teen girls in particular were often depicted as innocent victims or innocents in need of protection from evil environments and predatory threats. The word evil is used more than once in the records to describe workplaces and other locations. The Girl and Her Chance warns of the moral danger. Isn't that wonderful? I think it's a clip from an old movie. Warns of the moral danger to girls in the workplace. Its discussion of shop girls in department stores is also an example of predatory themes found in the literature of the workplace. Traveling men who are dissolute and are without the restraint of public opinion find here easy victims for their lust, and madams, when purchasing goods, make little presents to the girls, commiserating with them on their hard lot, and telling them that they themselves were once salesgirls. On every side, the girls see the glamour and brightly colored side of vice. Seldom she sees the horrible results. She becomes sophisticated, and is often persuaded that there is no harm in immorality if one is not found out. Though not explicitly discussed, the idea of moral danger and predation also sometimes appears to have implied what we would now call sexual harassment. Young Working Girls has what may be the earliest reference, albeit a veiled one, in the archives that I have found to sexual harassment. The authors weigh the danger of office work for young women, stating, "The girl is thrown into direct relations with a few people, and while the men with whom she is associating are not so intentionally unscrupulous as in the case of many dry goods establishments, it is increasingly clear that they are often," and this is in quotes, "a little too human." The office in which considerable number of girls are employed is the safest, especially where there is a competent woman as the manager. Romanticized views of innocent victims are also common. For example, following the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, the newspaper cartoons showed dramatic images of dead factory girls, childlike and angelic, and female symbols of society, justice, and grief. So here's civic opinion knocking on the door of City Hall, or pounding on the door of City Hall. These cartoons present the workers as innocents in need of protection and exploited, fragile, or ethereal victims. The one on the left is particularly good, the clasping of the hands is sort of the traditional heroine gesture, and the door is locked by criminal negligence. And then on the right, that is the classic female symbol of justice, holding aloft this draped body of a dead factory worker. At the mass meeting following the Triangle Fire, Rabbi Stephen Weiss, a Reform rabbi and social justice advocate, used the theme of protecting innocent women, but also appeared to recognize the civic and legal injustices at play in women's work. Our guilt is immeasurably magnified because women, in the main, were the victims of the disaster. We stand humiliated before the dishonor which is ours, of so ordering society that women in large numbers must be bearers of burdens, and yet be left unprotected and undefended in a government of men, by men, and for men. In When a Women's Workroom Burns, Mary Sumner gave a frankly weird description of a dead 17-year-old factory worker killed in the Newark fire, whom she describes as lying in her unfolded coffin like a bed, dressed in clothes that were like those of a bride. I would argue that the words and images surrounding health and innocence also related to what was perceived as the ultimate threat to young women at work, that the conditions of their work would prevent them through death, maiming, or poor health from fulfilling their true role as wives and mothers, and thereby threatening society from beneath by producing unhealthy or degenerate future generations. And I don't have time to share detailed quotes, but phrases such as mothers of the race or references to current or future motherhood are common, and images and words contrasting health, vigor, vitality with listlessness, degeneration, and weakness are deployed in the cause of protecting women workers. I would be remiss in discussing women in work in the early 20th century without including debates about regulating or eliminating prostitution. Anti-prostitution reformers combined economic, moral, and protectionist arguments. They mixed moral judgment of prostitutes and other women who fell into the gray areas of early 20th century sex trades with instances of rare compassion, or more commonly pity, and condemnation of the system of prostitution and its operatives. And a report and documents in the archives list methods of coercion employed in trafficking and prostituting women, including employment scams, contracts to perform in cabarets, what we would now call grooming by pimps or boyfriends, immigration scams, falsification of marriage papers or coercion to pose as wives and daughters of the trafficker, and use of debt and violence as means of control and intimidation. And the slides in the next couple of slides are photographs by Louis Hine, who's one of the great early 20th century American documentary photographers. So these are men and women in a club, and these women might fall into sort of that gray area that some of the reformers were concerned about in terms of sex trades. And then the casino and dance hall on the left-hand side, and I got so excited when I found the one on the right. It's really difficult to find these types of photos. So here's a troupe of dancers performing either in a cabaret or a dance hall, posing for a photograph. And these are young women who would have been considered sort of morally suspect and possibly prostitutes by the reformers of the time. So an international trafficking report from 1927 and 28 lists 4, and these are their words, sources of supply that are worth listing because I feel that they reveal something about the complex range of attitudes towards prostitution and the broad categorization of what constituted prostitution, as well as contemporary understandings about the dangers facing women who were already in the system or potential recruits. So type 1, the regular prostitute whose earnings are decreasing. Right, and she's portrayed as tricked and exploited by the trafficker, but still in need of protection. Type 2, the semi-professional or complacent girl, usually a minor from a rural, poor community who's depicted as having bad judgment and a love of money that leads her astray. Type 3, girls who join traveling troupes and perform in low-class music halls and cabarets, so you dance and theater majors out there. Also portrayed as being tricked by misleading contracts or desperate because of low wages and falling into prostitution, a word that is often used. And finally, the worst case of all is the innocent girl who is tricked by a boyfriend or a pimp into a fake or a real marriage and separated from her family. And then the unhappy victim learns what is expected of her. Though always ready to offer up judgment, reformers were often also aware of the coercive nature of prostitution, the associated hazards to the prostitutes themselves, and the systems of exploitation that supported it. The report of the Philadelphia Vice Commission from 1913 states, "We believe hundreds of girls are kept in Philadelphia in a life of prostitution because the escape from that life is purposely made extremely difficult. They are kept constantly in debt to madams and pimps. They are informed and believe their immunity from arrest and imprisonment depends on their keeping in with the madams, owners, and police. Their earnings are constantly taken from them or turned over by them to their pimps and lovers, so they have no money of their own, and they are commonly terrorized by threats of physical punishment." And this slide is from a Vice survey of Detroit in 1926, has an account of beatings and threats faced by a young woman who, well, apparently not actually a prostitute, would probably have been included in that casual category by investigators. So visions of victims, albeit not always so innocent, were part of reformers' methods of arguing against legalized prostitution or tolerance of prostitution in red light districts, and accounts of exploitation and danger supported the argument against legal prostitution systems, such as those that were present in Europe. So the narratives surrounding working women and danger, whether in a factory, office, shop, or brothel, and their physical, moral, and maternal well-being existed alongside more practical recognitions of the economic necessity for women's work, for them, their families, industry, and society, the inequities of their situation, and their reasons for working. Sources in the archives discuss exploitation of women workers through low wages, gender or race discrimination, wage theft and debt, playing off of groups against each other, and the lack of labor representation. And working women themselves, when quoted, made it clear they saw the dangers and the potential for exploitation, but that the money was a necessity and other options were often not available. And social workers and reformers brought varying degrees of reality and mythology to their work. And though some regretted the necessity for women to work, or sometimes failed to recognize their desire to work, and longed for the ideal of a labor system in which one male head of a household could support a family on his wages, others recognized the factors, both voluntary and involuntary, that brought women to the workplace and argued for greater workplace equality in terms that might still resonate today. There were calls for worker protections and safety regulations that were grounded more in the concept of women workers' equal rights to them, and challenges to fallacies that undermined those claims. For example, the U.S. Women's Bureau pamphlet, Health Problems of Women in Industry, published in 1921, addresses what the female authors call the pin money fallacy. Right, the popular superstition that she is working to make a little extra money and will soon be married and be on Easy Street for the rest of her life. And the standards for the employment of women in industry, also issued in 1921, includes the declaration that wages should be determined on the basis of occupation and not on the basis of sex or race. The National Consumers League pamphlet, Women's Demand for Humane Treatment of Women Workers in Shop and Factory, published in 1909, argues for benefits and safety as basic worker rights. It seems to the women who have studied these things that proper sanitary conditions, lunchrooms, comfortable seats, provision for rest, vacations with pay, and the like are no more than the wage earners due. They are part of the laborer's hire and should be guaranteed by law, exactly as wages are guaranteed. An employer deserves gratitude for overtime pay no more than for the fire escapes. As our hard-working woman clocks out at the end of her 10-hour day, she reminds me that time is almost up. This talk has presented only a few examples of the dangers, real and perceived, faced by working women and girls in the early 20th century. There are more documented in the archives, and some, like Fossey Jaw, are thankfully a thing of the past, but other hazards and inequities remain to be addressed.
So I don't think we really have time for questions today, but if you have any for the curators that spoke today, or would like to check out their collections, I'm sure they would be happy to talk to you individually. So just a reminder, we do have 2 exhibits going on right now. On the ground floor is Festival, Spectacle, and Celebration in the Early Modern World, which is on the ground floor in the Maxine Wallen Center, which is room 15. As well as It's Such a Big Dream, I Can't See It All, an exhibition on the life and work of photographer Edward S. Curtis, which is on the Atrium Gallery there, as well as the 2nd and 3rd floors. And there is, we also recently moved the Sherlock Holmes room over from Wilson Library, so that is also available to view on the 2nd floor. And so it kind of recreates the feeling of 221B Baker Street. And just a reminder, we will be taking a break in January, so do not come in the first week of January or you will be sitting in an empty room and very sad. But please join us again on February 1st for our next First Friday event, which will be featuring presentations from the Bell Library and the Northwest Architectural Archives. Thank you.